Beds are for children who are loved, she used to say while spreading blankets on the cold floor for me. Then her house burned down and she came to me asking for shelter. And I let her in. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was having my coffee. I hadn't heard her voice in almost 3 years, not since I'd stopped trying to maintain any kind of relationship with that side of the family. Her voice was shaky, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. The house was gone. Everything was gone. Her own children had turned their backs on her, and she had nowhere else to go. I was 8 when my parents died in that car accident. The social worker explained that I'd be living with my aunt and uncle, that they were family and would take care of me. What she didn't mention was that I'd never really be part of that family. From the very first night, the difference was crystal clear. Their 2 kids got the bedrooms upstairs with the soft mattresses and warm blankets. I got the living room floor with a thin camping mat and whatever spare blanket they could find. "You're lucky we even took you in," she'd remind me whenever I complained about the cold seeping through the floorboards or the way my back ached every morning. Her own children never had to hear those words. They never had to wonder if they belonged, never had to earn their place at the dinner table or justify their existence in that house. The sleeping arrangement was just the beginning. While her kids got new school clothes each fall, I wore hand-me-downs that were already worn thin. When they went to summer camp, I stayed home to do extra chores. When they had friends over, I was expected to make myself scarce. The message was always the same. This wasn't really my home, these weren't really my people, and I should be grateful for whatever scraps of family life they threw my way. School became my escape. I threw myself into my studies with a desperation that my teachers probably misinterpreted as natural ambition. Really, I was just trying to build something that was mine, something that couldn't be taken away or diminished by the constant reminders that I was the unwanted extra mouth to feed. I stayed late for every activity I could, volunteering for cleanup duty, joining clubs I had no real interest in, anything to delay going back to that house. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort of sleeping on the floor or wearing clothes that didn't fit quite right. It was the emotional isolation, the way I learned to make myself smaller and quieter, hoping that maybe if I took up less space, I'd cause less resentment. I became an expert at reading the room, sensing when my presence was particularly unwelcome, when my aunt's mood was especially sour about having to care for someone else's child. Christmas mornings were brutal in their own special way. I'd watch her own kids tear through piles of wrapped presents while I got one small gift, usually something practical like socks or school supplies. She'd make a big show of pointing out how generous they were being, reminding me that not all children got anything at all. Her kids never had to hear about how lucky they were. Their gifts were given freely, joyfully, without the weight of obligation and resentment. Update 1. High school brought its own challenges, but also opportunities. I got a part-time job at a local grocery store, telling my aunt it was to learn responsibility and contribute to the household. Really, it was my ticket to independence. Every dollar I earned went into a bank account she didn't know about. I had dreams of college, of getting far away from that house and never looking back. The job also gave me something I'd never had before, adults who treated me with basic respect. My manager was tough but fair. My coworkers included me in their conversations, invited me to their barbecues, treated me like I mattered. For the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere, even if it was just a small grocery store on the outskirts of town. But the contrast between work and home became even more painful. I'd spend 8 hours being treated like a valued team member, then come home to be reminded that I was taking up space that belonged to someone else. The floor felt even harder after days spent feeling human again. My grades were good enough to get me into state college with some financial aid, but I still needed money for living expenses. I worked double shifts that summer, saving every penny I could. My aunt made comments about how I was never around to help with household chores anymore, how selfish I was becoming. Her own children, who were old enough to work but chose not to, never heard similar criticism. The day I left for college was quietly devastating in its lack of ceremony. Her own kids had gotten tearful goodbye parties when they'd left for their various adventures. I loaded my few belongings into a borrowed car while she watched from the kitchen window. No goodbye. No good luck wishes, just a slight nod when I looked back before driving away. College was everything I'd hoped it would be. I worked in the cafeteria to pay for my meal plan, cleaned offices in the evenings to cover my expenses, and for the first time in my life, I had my own bed. My own small dorm room that no one could take away from me. I made friends who knew nothing about my history, who accepted me for who I was rather than treating me like a burden they'd inherited. I studied business with a focus that bordered on obsession. Every class, every assignment, Every exam was a step further away from that house and closer to a life where I'd never have to depend on anyone's charity again. My professors noticed my dedication, and several became mentors who helped me navigate internships and job opportunities. During holiday breaks, I stayed on campus, volunteering to work in the nearly empty cafeteria or finding other ways to earn money. I told myself it was practical, that I needed the income, but honestly, I just couldn't face going back to that house. The few times I did visit, nothing had changed. The floor was still my designated sleeping spot. The reminders about being lucky to be there still constant. Update 2. Graduation came with a job offer from a company 2 states away. I packed everything I owned into the same borrowed car and drove toward what felt like real freedom. The apartment I could finally afford wasn't fancy, but it had a proper bed with a real mattress, and every morning when I woke up in it, I felt like I'd won something important. Work went well. I was hungry in a way that my colleagues, who'd grown up secure and loved, couldn't quite match. Every promotion, every raise, every recognition felt like proof that I was worth something, that I'd been worthy all along. I bought a house by the time I was 25, nothing extravagant, but it was mine with my name on the deed. The years passed quietly. I dated occasionally, but found it hard to let people get close. I learned too early that love could be conditional, that family could be something you had to earn rather than something you simply belonged to. I built a comfortable life, surrounded by acquaintances and casual friendships, but kept the deeper parts of myself carefully protected. I thought about my aunt's family sometimes, usually when I saw happy families in restaurants or parks. I wondered if her own children appreciated having beds to sleep in, having love given freely rather than rationed out based on behavior. I hoped they'd never know what it felt like to question whether they deserved basic comfort and affection. Social media showed me glimpses of their lives over the years. College graduations, weddings, new babies, all celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm and pride that had never been directed my way. I felt no bitterness about their happiness, but I also felt no connection to their celebrations. They were strangers who happened to share some DNA with me. Then came that Tuesday morning phone call that changed everything. The fire had started in the early hours of the morning, some kind of electrical problem in the old wiring. By the time the fire department arrived, most of the house was already gone. My aunt and uncle had escaped with nothing but the clothes they were wearing and whatever they'd managed to grab in those first panicked moments. Her voice broke as she told me about standing in the street watching everything burn. The photo albums, the furniture, the beds her children had slept in, all of it reduced to ash and memories. The insurance would cover some of it eventually, but the immediate need was shelter, a place to stay while they figured out what came next. That's when she told me about reaching out to her own children first. I wasn't surprised that they'd all found reasons why they couldn't help. Adult lives are complicated, full of mortgages and marriages and responsibilities that make taking in displaced parents difficult. But I could hear in her voice that their rejections had cut deep, that she'd expected different from the children she'd raised with such obvious love and preference. Update 3. I should have felt vindicated. Here was the woman who'd spent years reminding me that I should be grateful for scraps, now reduced to asking for help from the nephew she'd never quite accepted as family. I should have felt some satisfaction in having the power to say no, to remind her about beds being for children who are loved, to let her experience what it felt like to have nowhere to belong. Instead, I surprised myself by saying yes almost immediately. Not because I'd forgiven her, and not because I'd suddenly developed warm feelings for the woman who'd made my childhood so lonely. I said yes because I'd become someone different than the child who'd slept on her floor, someone who could choose kindness even when it wasn't deserved or expected. The drive to pick them up took 3 hours. I spent most of it wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was setting myself up for more disappointment and manipulation. But when I saw them standing outside the Red Cross shelter with their few salvaged belongings, they looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Age and loss had worn them down in ways that made their past power over me seem almost impossible to believe. The ride back to my house was awkward and quiet. My aunt sat in the passenger seat staring out the window while my uncle dozed in the back. Occasionally she'd make small comments about how nice my car was, how well I seemed to be doing, but there was none of the usual edge to her observations. She seemed genuinely surprised that I'd built such a stable life, as if she'd never quite believed I was capable of taking care of myself, let alone anyone else. When we got to my house, I showed them to the guest room I'd set up. It wasn't fancy, but it had a comfortable bed with clean sheets and a private bathroom. My aunt stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the bed like she was seeing something impossible. Then she walked through the rest of the house, taking in the furniture I'd chosen, the photos I'd hung, the life I'd built entirely without her input or support. She stopped in my bedroom, staring at my king-sized bed with its thick mattress and pile of soft pillows. The contrast with those nights on her living room floor couldn't have been more obvious. I waited for her to say something cutting, some comment about how I was showing off or getting above myself. Instead, she just stood there for a long time before turning to me with tears in her eyes. That's when she said it. "I'm sorry." 2 words that I'd waited 20 years to hear, delivered in a voice so small I almost missed them. She didn't elaborate or make excuses or try to explain away the years of making me feel unwanted. She just acknowledged that she'd been wrong, that I deserved better, that the child she'd made sleep on the floor had grown into someone good enough to offer her a bed when she needed one most. I didn't know how to respond to her apology. Part of me wanted to reject it, to point out how little and how late it was. Another part of me wanted to accept it gracefully and pretend that 2 words could somehow balance out years of emotional neglect. Instead, I just nodded and told her dinner would be ready in an hour. Final update. They stayed for 3 months while they worked with insurance companies and looked for a new place to live. During that time, something shifted between us, though I'm not sure I'd call it healing exactly. My aunt helped with cooking and cleaning without being asked, and for the first time I could remember, she seemed to see me as someone whose comfort and preferences mattered. My uncle, who'd always been quieter about the family dynamics, started telling me stories about my parents that I'd never heard before. Good memories, funny moments, things that helped me remember them as real people rather than just the tragic figures who'd left me orphaned. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed those stories until I heard them. The most surprising thing was how naturally we fell into a routine. Not like family exactly, but like people who could coexist peacefully and even enjoy each other's company occasionally. My aunt would have coffee ready when I got up for work, and I'd pick up groceries she needed when I was out running errands. Small kindnesses that felt revolutionary after years of careful distance. Her own children called occasionally, usually when they needed something or had news to share. I noticed that she spoke about me differently now, mentioning things I'd done for them or achievements in my career with something that almost sounded like pride. It was strange to hear her defend me to the same children she'd always prioritized over me, but I found I didn't need her validation the way I once had. When they finally found a small apartment across town and moved out, the goodbye was complicated. We hugged awkwardly, and my aunt pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. It was a letter she'd written but hadn't known how to give me directly. In it, she tried to explain her behavior over the years, to apologize more fully for the ways she'd failed me as a guardian and as family. She wrote about her own insecurities, her fear that she wasn't equipped to raise someone else's child, her resentment about having her life disrupted by tragedy. None of it excused what she'd done, but it helped me understand that her cruelty had come from her own limitations rather than any fundamental unworthiness on my part. The child who'd slept on her floor hadn't done anything wrong. The adult who'd made him sleep there had just been too broken to see past her own problems. I kept the letter but didn't respond to it immediately. Instead, I thought about the person I'd become and the choices that had brought me to that moment. I'd survived childhood, built a career, bought a house, and when the time came, I'd been able to offer help to people who'd once made me feel homeless in their own home. I'd proven to myself that I was worthy of love and comfort and basic human dignity, not because I'd earned it through perfect behavior, but simply because I existed. The experience taught me something important about forgiveness and strength. I didn't forgive my aunt because she deserved it or because her apology had somehow erased the past. I forgave her because holding on to that resentment was keeping me small in ways I was ready to outgrow. Letting her stay in my house wasn't about her at all. It was about becoming the kind of person who could choose generosity even when it wasn't convenient or expected. Months later, I redecorated the guest room and started hosting friends who needed a place to crash between apartments or during difficult life transitions. My house became known as a safe landing spot, a place where people could catch their breath and figure out their next steps. I discovered I was good at creating the kind of welcoming environment I'd always wished for as a child. I never became close with my aunt in the way some families reconnect after years of estrangement. Too much had happened. Too many crucial years had been poisoned by her treatment of me. But we developed a cordial relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. She'd send me birthday cards and I'd check on her after doctor appointments. Not love exactly, but something like peace. The most important thing I learned was that I'd always been deserving of better treatment, even when I was too young and powerless to demand it. The beds, the warm clothes, the sense of belonging I'd been denied, those hadn't been privileges I needed to earn. They were basic rights that every child should have, and the fact that mine had been withheld said nothing about my worth and everything about the adults who'd been too damaged to provide them. Now when people ask about my childhood, I tell them it was complicated, but that it taught me resilience and self-reliance. I don't dwell on the sleeping arrangements or the emotional neglect because those things are no longer the most important parts of my story. What matters more is how I responded to hardship, how I built something good from difficult circumstances, and how I learned to break cycles of hurt rather than perpetuating them. I sleep in my own bed every night now, surrounded by pillows I chose and blankets I bought because I like them. Sometimes I think about that 8-year-old boy on the living room floor, and I wish I could tell him that he was worthy of comfort and love even then, that he'd grow up to be someone strong enough to offer shelter to others, and that the woman who made him sleep on the floor would one day stand in his bedroom and apologize for not seeing his worth sooner. But mostly I just sleep peacefully, grateful for the journey that brought me here and proud of the person I chose to become despite everything that tried to convince me I was less than I was.